Hey guys, tonight we drift into a coastline of wind-bitten cliffs and gray waves where you stand in the damp pre-dawn chill of 1805, watching Napoleon's great invasion force gather at Boulogne. You can almost taste the salt blown off the channel as 150,000 soldiers shuffle, mutter, and adjust their gear in the half-light. Horses snort somewhere behind you, 7,000 of them, tethered in long, restless lines, stamping hooves into mud that never quite dries. You feel the strange mix of anticipation and dread that comes with watching history lean forward, because deep down, you probably won't survive this if the barges flip over. But Napoleon keeps promising that everything is under control, and you pretend to believe him in that soft, sleepy way you whisper reassurance to yourself before bed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because I always love seeing how far this little bedtime corner reaches across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand on the northern French coast, where Napoleon has built an entire floating city. For 2 years, he's ordered barges, flat-bottomed and stubbornly unseaworthy, to be constructed in clusters. They bob on their moorings like oversized wooden bathtubs, and even the French admirals keep exchanging side-eye glances that say, "Are we really doing this?" One mainstream historical fact: those barges truly were criticized as dangerously unstable in rough water, and you can feel why as one thumps against another with a hollow clap. But the emperor insists they'll work because they have to work. You breathe in the damp scent of tar and seaweed and realize this is one of those moments where ambition outruns engineering. A quirky tidbit floats through your mind. French musicians supposedly practiced playing patriotic marches on some barges so the troops wouldn't panic during the crossing. You imagine a terrified drummer trying to stay upright as waves toss his instrument around like a disgruntled cat toy. It's not exactly the heroic image most textbooks present, but you can't deny the sincerity in it. What you can't see from the beach, but sense in Napoleon's restless pacing, is how important timing is. He isn't just amassing troops, he's staging a synchronized continental heartbeat. The invasion of Britain, that distant island that never seems to stop mocking him, depends entirely on the Franco-Spanish fleet breaking free, linking up, and clearing the channel for just a few crucial days. You hear the grind of wagon wheels hauling more supplies into camp, salted meat, powder, biscuits so hard you could use them as blunt weapons. Napoleon's logistical mind is everywhere at once, down to the last nail, the last hunk of cheese, the last spare musket. Historians still argue whether Napoleon truly believed a full invasion was feasible, or if he simply used the massive buildup to intimidate Britain. You tilt your head, imagining him glancing across the water toward Dover's chalk cliffs and smirking. Maybe he hoped the British would blink first. Maybe he hoped the weather would obey him for once. Or maybe he was the kind of man who convinced himself that whatever he wanted badly enough would simply happen. Anyone who later ordered armies to march into Russia in winter is clearly comfortable making bold assumptions. Around you, soldiers are training relentlessly. You watch a line of grenadiers drill with the kind of focus usually reserved for defusing bombs or picking a lock when you've forgotten the key. Their boots slap rhythmically in the dirt, left, right, left, echoing between tents stitched with the sighs of exhausted men. You see officers riding up and down the ranks, barking instructions, correcting postures, tapping shoulders. Even when you close your eyes, the soundscape persists. Lapping water, the sharp crack of a musket being tested, the murmur of engineers arguing about barge stability, a horse relieving itself way too close to your boots. Napoleon himself strides through these training grounds constantly. You watch him pause to examine a musket, then a saddle, then a rope used to lash horses onto the barges. His presence pulses through the camp like static electricity. He's shorter than you expect. Yes, the man really was around average height for his time, contrary to the popular myth, but his intensity makes him feel like a pocket-sized thunderstorm waiting to strike. When he speaks, even the waves seem to hush for a moment. There's a gentle ASMR rhythm to the camp despite its military purpose. The repetitive clink of metal, the brushing of hooves against packed sand, the faint creak of strapped barrels as sailors secure supplies. You catch yourself relaxing to it, as strange as that sounds in the middle of an invasion launch pad. The gentle sarcasm in your own internal monologue surfaces. Nothing makes me sleepy like an impending cross-channel military gamble. At night, the camp glows with lanterns swaying in the wind. Smoke rises from cook fires as soldiers trade stories, some exaggerated, some quietly confessional. You overhear one insisting that the British eat nothing but boiled vegetables and that they'll surrender immediately if confronted by proper French cuisine. Another claims the barges are secretly blessed by a priest from Marseille who specializes in marine miracles, though you suspect he's pulling that out of his beautifully tailored hat. Still, every army needs its superstitions. From high ground, you can see the rows upon rows of tents, the endless stacks of crates, the organized chaos of preparation. It looks like the world's most intimidating festival campsite. Napoleon inspects everything, leaning over maps lit by flickering candles, sketching trajectories, marking tides. The English Channel might only be a narrow stretch of water, but tonight it feels like an entire universe separating two wildly different destinies. The real tension builds as you realize the invasion hinges on events happening hundreds of miles away. Even now, the Royal Navy sails like a restless guardian serpent, determined to strangle this entire operation. Napoleon knows if the French and Spanish fleets fail to break the blockade, everything you're witnessing becomes nothing more than a damp footnote. He needs Villeneuve to succeed, desperately. And yet, a faint unease curls in your stomach as you remember that, historically, this very moment spiraled into confusion, scattered fleets, and disastrous timing. But tonight's story is not history. It's the gentle dream of a world where the fog lifts, the winds calm, and the Emperor's plan clicks into place like a lock turning open. You take one last look at the horizon, blinking as a sharp breeze brushes your face. The barges sway, the soldiers murmur, and somewhere out at sea, destiny is already rolling toward you on hungry waves. You wake the next morning to the mingled sounds of gulls and shouted orders, the air tasting of salt and wood smoke as you move through the camp where Napoleon's nerves hum like a violin string stretched too tight. The wind still claws at your coat, but there's a changed mood drifting across the tents, something focused, sharpened, almost suspiciously calm. You realize why when you hear officers whispering the same phrase over and over, like a mantra they're scared to jinx. No confusing orders this time. It feels like someone finally found the Napoleon settings menu and switched off chaotic improvisation. It's strange watching the Emperor choose clarity over cleverness. Usually he can't resist rewriting the plan at the last minute, scribbling addendums on maps, sending couriers galloping in 5 different directions to ensure everyone hears slightly different versions of his genius. But now, you sense an unusual restraint. The command structure settles into place like puzzle pieces actually fitting. Fleet coordination that historically fell apart begins to hum with coherence. You can almost hear Villeneuve exhaling from hundreds of miles away. One mainstream historical fact drifts through your mind. Napoleon's real orders in 1805 were notoriously tangled, splitting the French and Spanish fleets just long enough for the Royal Navy to exploit the chaos. But here, in this alternate timeline, you feel everything being tightened. No more scattered squadrons chasing phantom British fleets around the Atlantic. No more frantic last-minute course changes. Instead, Napoleon keeps the fleets concentrated, like a fist instead of 5 wiggling fingers. You imagine Villeneuve at his desk in Cadiz, rubbing his temples as he reads the emperor's message. Not a labyrinth, not a riddle, not one of those infamous letters where Napoleon tries to micromanage sailors despite knowing very little about sailing. Just one clear instruction: unite the fleet, hold position, strike the moment weather and opportunity align. The simplicity practically glows. Historians still argue whether Villeneuve lacked confidence or simply drowned under Napoleon's conflicting expectations. Some say he was cautious to a fault. Others claim he was secretly terrified of disappointing the emperor. You picture him pacing the quarterdeck, staring at the horizon with a stomach full of dread and salted fish, muttering, "Please let the wind behave, just this once." Back in Boulogne, the atmosphere shifts. You see engineers measuring tide tables, sailors charting wind patterns, cavalry officers receiving streamlined timetables for embarkation. Even the famously temperamental artillery crews seem more relaxed, polishing their guns while humming tuneless little melodies. It's the closest you've ever seen to a French army operating without drama. A quirky tidbit surfaces. From time to time, Napoleon supposedly disguised himself to wander the camp and listen to soldiers talk. You imagine him now, wearing a questionable fake beard, leaning casually against a barrel while 2 sailors debate whether the British mint their gold coins with actual tea leaves. You drift toward the coastal cliffs, where signal towers stand like skeletal giants against the sky. Semaphore operators flick their shutters back and forth, relaying crisp, unambiguous messages across dozens of miles. The rhythm is hypnotic. Clack, pause, clack. Each movement carrying the pulse of a coordinated empire. Watching the signals jump from tower to tower feels oddly soothing, like a giant mechanical lullaby guiding fleets into synergy. Napoleon studies the channel through a brass spyglass, his boots sinking slightly into wet sand. His coat snaps in the wind, and though he says nothing, you feel the weight of what he's trying to accomplish. Britain's naval dominance isn't just a challenge, it's practically a law of nature. Trying to outmaneuver the Royal Navy can feel like trying to outswim a shark using only optimism and strong language. But with the fleets unified, French and Spanish masts foresting the horizon like a moving city, Napoleon finally looks less like a gambler and more like a strategist patiently waiting for his opponent to blink. You hear officers discussing the new coordination protocol, exact rendezvous points near Cape Finisterre, unified engagement rules, and precise timing for sailing north. Even the notoriously prickly Spanish commanders seem on board this time, though one grumbles that French sailors drink far too much coffee and not enough wine. Priorities, clearly. As the day stretches on, you wander between the beach and the bustling port. The barges bob rhythmically, tied together like nervous geese. Soldiers practice loading and unloading horses with the subdued determination of people who know the sea has no mercy. Somewhere nearby, a medic lectures a group of recruits on seasickness remedies that sound suspiciously like old wives' tales. Chewing raw ginger, tying a ribbon around your wrist, or eating oranges while facing north. You mentally file these away for future use or future mockery. The sense of coordination radiates beyond France. In Spain, messages arrive at Cadiz with uncharacteristic punctuality. Villeneuve, poor, stressed Villeneuve, begins to realize he won't have to chase half the Atlantic before joining with his allies. The fleets are gathering like storm clouds drawn by the same gravitational pull. For once, it feels like Napoleon's naval plans might not collapse under the weight of their own ambition. You close your eyes and imagine the Franco-Spanish Armada forming, hulls creaking in the swell, sails snapping taut, crews murmuring in 2 languages that blend into one anxious harmony. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the confidence building. Or maybe it's just indigestion from that biscuit you ate earlier. the one shaped suspiciously like a tile stolen from someone's roof. By evening, the camp settles again, though this time with less tension and more inevitability. You watch Napoleon visit the shoreline one last time, boots sinking into the tide line as he murmurs something you can't quite catch. Maybe a prayer, maybe a threat directed at the sea, maybe just a grocery list he forgot to finish. And as the lanterns begin to glow in long, trembling rows across the tents, you feel the entire rhythm of the channel shift. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of your sleepy eyes, Villeneuve is preparing a breakout that history denied him. But tonight, in this imagined drift toward a gentler dream, the fleets are finally moving as one. You sense the air tighten around you long before the message riders thunder into camp with news from the south. It's the kind of tension that presses gently on your chest, like the world is holding a breath too big to swallow. When the horses arrive, foam on their flanks and dust caked in their manes, you already know what they're going to say. Villeneuve has moved. He has actually slipped the Cadiz blockade. For a moment, you just stand there blinking at the horizon, as if the news might be a mirage. But no, this time, in this alternate world, the admiral who carried centuries of Mediterranean hesitation finally squeezes through a window history barely cracked open. The British blockade around Cadiz has always felt like a steel trap, its jaws held by relentless patrols that sniff out any attempt to break free. Yet here you are, staring at a scene that defies the heavy expectations laid on Villeneuve's shoulders. You imagine him aboard his flagship, Bucentaure, pacing the deck in that stiff, almost apologetic way he moves, glancing nervously toward the British line, while the morning fog coils protectively around his masts. For once, the weather isn't mocking him, the wind isn't slapping him, the currents aren't sabotaging him. Everything aligns, subtly, imperfectly, but undeniably. A mainstream historical fact brushes your ear. British blockades around French and Spanish ports were brutally efficient. So much so that whole fleets could sit bottled for months without daring to move. But today, the patrolling British ships are scattered by 2 days of turbulent weather, their formation frayed just enough that Villeneuve sees an opening. His captains argue, of course, they always do. But eventually, the admiral gives a quiet, steely nod, and the fleet begins to creep forward like a giant waking from an uneasy sleep. Historians still argue whether Villeneuve's real-life hesitation stemmed from lack of confidence, fear of Napoleon, or the simple understanding that he was badly outmatched. Some claim he read the winds too cautiously. Others think he was paralyzed by the weight of potential catastrophe. In this alternate timeline, though, you feel him trembling on the edge of resolve, and for once, resolve wins. You picture him whispering something like, "Just this once," before barking the order to set sail. You follow the riders up the coastal ridge, where Napoleon is already receiving the news. The Emperor's eyes glitter, the way someone's eyes do when a stubborn lock finally clicks open. He stands rigid for a moment, absorbing the implications. The fleet has left Cadiz. The blockade did not close its jaws in time. The Franco-Spanish ships are now fanning into the Atlantic, gathering wind like giant lungs. He sends a single courier galloping to the signal tower. Maintain readiness. Keep the army on alert. The channel may clear soon. Meanwhile, your imagination drifts south across rolling waves. You see the Spanish coastline shrinking behind Villeneuve as his fleet forms a cautious, sprawling line. Sails bloom white against the deep blue sea. Cannons glint beneath tarps. Signal flags whip in the early breeze. French crews, jittery but determined, work with quick, precise movements. Spanish sailors chant instructions in raspy bursts of Castilian. The decks creak like weary bones. One quirky tidbit surfaces. Some captains reportedly believed that sprinkling deck planks with wine before battle brought good luck. You can almost smell the sour sweetness as a superstitious officer sloshes a cup's worth near the prow. whispering a prayer to both God and probability. Far to the west, a small British frigate finally spots the movement and wheels around in surprise, its signal flag snapping upward as it races to warn the blockade. But the timing is too late. The wind favors Villeneuve. A swell of adrenaline sweeps through the ranks as the Allied sails catch the breeze and push northward before British reinforcements can tighten the net. You feel that same swell lift your heart, even as your rational brain whispers, you know this will get messy later. Back in Boulogne, the soldiers gather in loose clusters to hear fragments of the news, some leaning on muskets, others perched on crates, still half drowsy from poor sleep. You hear snippets. He's done it? Villeneuve? Really? Are we sure it's not a rumor? A young drummer boy mutters, "If this works, I'm never complaining about blisters again," which feels like a lie, but still counts as optimistic. Napoleon doesn't celebrate. Not yet. He's too pragmatic. You watch him study a fresh map pinned to a wooden board, his fingers tapping against the coastline with a soft thup, thup, thup. The invasion is still a dream, waiting for a wind favorable enough to carry it. But now at least, the dream draws breath. Villeneuve drifting north means that the Franco-Spanish fleet can finally attempt the rendezvous that historically came too late and in too much confusion. It means Napoleon can keep the barges secured another day or two without slipping into despair. It means the channel isn't a foregone conclusion. The sailors near the shoreline begin preparing in earnest, their movements more energetic than before. Ropes are checked, rechecked, then checked again by someone who insists the third time's the charm. Officers rehearse embarkation orders under their breath. Even the horses seem restless, snorting as if they can smell the shift in fortune. You hear a group of infantrymen discussing what British villages might look like. One insists that every town has a pub on each corner. Another claims that English bread tastes like compressed fog. And a third insists he once met a man who said London smells like burning cabbage. None of this comforts you, but it does make you smile. Later in the afternoon, semaphore towers blink across the ridge, relaying the updated positions of Villeneuve's fleet as it pushes north. Napoleon watches the pattern of signals with narrowed eyes, nodding thoughtfully as officers murmur behind him. This kind of crisp relay work didn't exist in most earlier wars, and you marvel at how modern it feels, messages blinking across miles at speeds faster than a galloping horse. By evening, a gentle wind rolls over the dunes, carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. Somewhere out there, Villeneuve is steering his fleet toward one of the most pivotal what-ifs in naval history. And you, standing on the chilled sand with your hands deep in your coat pockets, feel the hum of a world shifting ever so slightly off the path you know. Tomorrow, the channel may open. Tomorrow, the invasion might become real. Tonight, you listen to the steady rhythm of tents flapping, barges creaking, and waves sighing against the shore, an unexpected lullaby for a moment of immense possibility. You feel the shift before you see it, the way tension settles into the camp like an invisible frost, prickling your skin as whispers race through the ranks. Villeneuve has reached the northern waters. The British are converging. And somewhere out there, on the rough open sea, two worlds are moving toward collision. You stand on a rise overlooking the gray channel, imagining the scene unfolding far beyond the horizon. Nelson's columns slicing forward in that signature formation everyone knows, everyone respects, and everyone fears. Except this time, Villeneuve is ready. The news spreads slowly at first, drifting down the lines like campfire smoke. Officers murmur, messengers hurry, and by noon, the entire shoreline seems to hum with anticipation. You walk between the rows of barges, their hulls ticking softly as the tide bumps them together, and you can almost hear the sailors out at sea tightening ropes, adjusting sails, preparing for the kind of battle that rewrites maps. A mainstream historical fact slips into your mind. Nelson's tactic at Trafalgar charging 2 perpendicular columns straight into the enemy line, worked brilliantly because the Allied fleet historically lost cohesion. But tonight, in your drifting half-dream narrative, the Allies are braced, aligned, unbroken. Historians still argue whether Nelson's approach was genius, madness, or the bold necessity of a commander who worshipped decisive action like a personal deity. And you can imagine him now, pacing the quarterdeck of HMS Victory, one hand tucked behind his back, the other tracing the air as he visualizes the attack he's launched a dozen times in his mind. You picture him murmuring to Hardy, eyes burning with the conviction of a man who assumes the universe prefers boldness over caution. But for the first time, the Franco-Spanish line is not the disorganized mass he expects. It's a wall. You inhale the cold, sharp sea air and imagine the moment when Nelson peers through his spyglass and frowns. Not a tiny frown, not a "someone stole my biscuits" frown. No, the deep, confused, irritated frown of a man realizing that a battle he expected to dominate isn't unfolding according to the script. The Allied ships maintain perfect spacing, sails trimmed tight, gunners poised. The line stretches across the water like a fortress of wood and canvas. French officers bark commands with clockwork precision. Spanish captains stand resolute, shouting encouragement down the decks. A quirky tidbit rises. Some Spanish sailors supposedly believed painting saints on the inside of gun ports blessed the accuracy of their cannons. You imagine tiny fading icons watching over the crews, calm little reminders that if divine intervention were ever needed, it would be today. Nelson's columns close fast. The British crews cheer, because that's what British crews do. They lean into the madness. You picture the crash of surf against the bows, the clipped commands echoing across decks, the salty air filled with the rising roar of battle. But as the first column nears the Allied line, something different happens. Instead of a disordered scramble, the Allied ships pivot in unison, their broadsides angled perfectly to rake Nelson's approach. You can almost feel the tremor of the first salvo, a deep, thunderous roll that shakes the timbers, rattles the air, and hurls smoke skyward in huge, ghostly plumes. The French gunnery crews, often dismissed historically as less disciplined than the British, fire with cold, deliberate cadence. Boom, boom, boom. A rolling sequence like the heartbeat of a giant. The Spanish ships join in, their cannons roaring with such force you swear you can hear the very sea flinch. Nelson's lead vessels take the brunt. HMS Victory, majestic and proud, drives forward into a storm of iron. You imagine the splinters spraying like wooden shrapnel, sailors ducking instinctively as masts groan and rigging snaps. British marksmen fire down from the fighting tops, their muskets cracking like dry branches, but the sheer volume of Allied firepower pins them down. You stroll along the French shoreline, boots sinking into damp sand. Soldiers gather in knots, listening to every distant report brought from semaphore towers. Every update arrives sharp and spare. Allied line holding. British column stalled. Villeneuve maintaining formation. Napoleon stands close by, arms folded, eyes narrowed. Not celebrating, not even smiling, but processing. He knows this moment, if real, changes everything. The Channel crossings, the invasion, the entire shape of Europe. Each depends on what happens out there on waves churned white with wind and war. In your mind's eye, you watch Nelson adjust desperately, signaling for tighter acceleration as the smoke thickens around him. The British ships cut forward, but each advance is met with coordinated barrages that chew into hulls and tangle rigging. Nelson himself, always exposed on deck, refuses to take shelter. You hear him calling out encouragement, his voice somehow calm amidst chaos. But in this alternate world, the crisp Allied line keeps him trapped in a funnel of fire. A French marksman, maybe not even aiming for greatness, fires a musket that arcs across the smoke. It finds Nelson. You see him falter, Hardy lunging to catch him. The iconic moment still exists, but twisted. Nelson doesn't fall after a triumphant breakthrough. He falls, realizing the line he challenged is unbroken. Back on shore, the British withdrawal is signaled hours later. Semaphore towers flash the message like a stunned gasp. Collingwood is pulling the fleet back, preserving what remains. You watch Napoleon absorb the news with a kind of stillness that chills you more than any cheer would have. The Channel might soon be safe. Villeneuve might actually have done it. Even as your eyelids grow heavy from the rhythmic crashing of waves and the wind brushing the dunes, you feel the world tilt a little. Tonight, Nelson's columns are not the unstoppable blades slicing the Allied fleet apart. Tonight, Villeneuve anticipates every motion, and the sea, for once, recognizes a different victor. You're barely awake when the first messengers sprint through camp shouting that the British line has broken. Not in the expected heroic British retreating but still terrifying way, but in the "this is actually happening, the Royal Navy is withdrawing" way. You sit up in the early gray dawn, blinking like someone who fell asleep during a movie and woke up to find the villain somehow winning. The Channel wind claws at your coat as you join the tide of soldiers and officers running toward the observation ridge. Everyone wants to see the signal towers. Everyone wants proof. When you reach the hilltop, breath fogging, you see the semaphore shutters snapping open and shut, swift, sharp, decisive. British fleet in full withdrawal. Villeneuve controls the field. Victory confirmed. The words ripple through the ranks like an electric pulse, and suddenly the entire shoreline feels unreal, dreamlike, like someone flipped history upside down and forgot to tell the textbooks. As you grip the cold railing, your mind drifts back to the battle unfolding far out at sea, replaying it like a half-remembered dream. You picture the Franco-Spanish line holding firm, masts lined in a disciplined serration across the churning Atlantic swell. When Nelson's columns plowed forward, expecting the usual chaos, the Allies instead unleashed what can only be described as a wooden and canvas guillotine of devastating broadside fire. You close your eyes and imagine the waves lit with cannon flashes, sails shuddering from impacts, the smell of gunpowder drifting thick enough to taste. One mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. Nelson really was fatally shot at Trafalgar, leaning on Hardy as chaos swirled around him. But this time, he falls not in a victorious blaze, but in the realization that Trafalgar has turned against him, that the Allies stayed in line, that the British cannot pierce their wall, that his final gamble has failed. The HMS Victory, proud and stubborn, becomes a wounded giant drifting in smoke. Historians still argue whether the British could ever have lost Trafalgar, given their superior gunnery and drilling. Some claim only total Allied coherence, which historically never existed, could have overwhelmed Nelson's tactic. And tonight, you drift gently through a universe where that impossible coherence forms like frost on a window. Because sometimes bedtime stories let the improbable breathe. Down on the French coast, artillery crews on standby stare out to sea as if waiting for British silhouettes to reappear. They won't. Collingwood, recognizing disaster, has already begun pulling ships away. You picture him pacing his quarterdeck, face grim, muttering something painfully honest like, "Live to fight the next war," even though a little voice in the back of his mind is whispering that this changes everything. Meanwhile, Napoleon receives the news almost serenely. No fist pumping, no grand speech. Just a quiet tightening of his jaw as he runs a thumb across the map spread before him. He whispers something to Berthier, who nods and darts off like a frantic quill on legs. Behind them, the Channel breeze rustles through folded tents and stacked crates. For the first time in his life, Napoleon sees a clear pathway across the water. For the first time, Britain looks vulnerable. You follow the movement of the soldiers around you. Veterans in the camp are both elated and nervous. They know winning the sea doesn't mean surviving the crossing. A drummer taps an upbeat rhythm with hands still trembling from the news. A cavalryman adjusts his saddle and jokes that if he drowns mid-channel, at least he hopes it's while riding heroically. A quirky tidbit drifts through memory. Some French units had already designed miniature invasion medals in anticipation of landing on English soil. They weren't official, just playful tokens. But now you imagine those soldiers touching them, wondering if they'll actually wear them on Kentish soil. And out on the water, Villeneuve himself stands on the Bucentaure, staring at the retreating British sails, with a mixture of disbelief and relief so intense it feels like an exhale 20 years overdue. You picture him running a shaking hand down the worn rail. He didn't just survive a battle, he won it. He won Trafalgar. His fleet, battered, burnt, rope snarled, but afloat, now commands the Channel, at least for long enough. Napoleon's staff begins reorganizing embarkation schedules instantly. Soldiers packed into barges will now launch under Allied naval protection, rather than slipping past a British firing line. The Emperor orders additional scouts to monitor weather, because even a victorious fleet can't shield men from storm-tossed chaos. The Channel remains wild and unpredictable, a reminder that nature ignores the vanity of generals. As you walk past stacks of muskets and crates marked with chalk scribbles, you hear a sergeant explaining something to a group of fresh recruits. If you land in England, don't worry about the cows. They're smaller than ours. You're not sure if that's true, but the confidence is calming. Two soldiers gamble with carved bone dice, betting half rations on whether the British will mount a counterattack. One says no, because they've lost their greatest commander. The other says yes, because the British never quit. And somewhere between their banter, you feel reality teetering. Later that evening, while lanterns flicker in long, trembling lines across the camp, you climb again to the ridge. The waves below look darker, almost metallic in the fading light. No British silhouettes break the horizon. Only the steady hush of the tide rolls in, soft as a lullaby. For a moment, you let the sounds settle into your bones. Far away, Villeneuve is already arranging patrol lines, securing the sea lanes, and tending to wounded crews. The Allied fleet is damaged but functional, enough to keep the channel open for the crossing, enough to let the invasion unfold. Napoleon stands beside the signal tower just as dusk settles in, hands clasped behind him. He watches the darkening water without blinking, as if willing the sea itself to obey. You imagine him whispering something only the waves can hear. We're coming. Tonight, Trafalgar isn't the grave of French naval ambition. Tonight, it becomes the gateway. You wake before sunrise to the deep, throaty growl of waves hammering the French coast. Rougher, louder, more impatient than yesterday. And for a moment, you wonder if the sea is trying to warn you. The channel doesn't want to be crossed. It never has. Yet as you step out into the cold morning air, boots sinking into wet sand, you see soldiers already lining up near the water, shivering not from fear, but from the brutal wind knifing across the dunes. Napoleon is finally doing it. He's ordered the invasion to begin. The barges jitter nervously on their moorings, slapping the waves like startled animals. Flat-bottomed, fragile, and about as seaworthy as a bread box, they were never meant for storms. And of course it's a storm. Of course the channel looks like a cauldron someone filled with gray foam and shook violently. You can practically hear the French admirals muttering, "We told you," under their breath. But Villeneuve's victory has carved open a window, maybe not wide, but wide enough for Napoleon's ambition to squeeze through. If he waits, the Royal Navy might regroup. If he hesitates, Britain survives. So he doesn't. A mainstream historical fact anchors the madness. Those invasion barges truly were designed for calm coastal waters, not the open channel. And many French officers openly doubted they'd make the crossing intact. Standing beside one now, its hull groaning as it rises and falls in the swell, you understand exactly why. You imagine yourself stepping onto that thing and immediately regretting every life choice that led to this beach. Historians still argue whether Napoleon would have risked crossing in such dangerous conditions, even if the channel had been cleared. Some insist he'd never gamble elite soldiers on unstable boats. Others believe he absolutely would, convinced that sheer force of will could tame weather. Tonight, you drift into the version where ambition wins the argument. You inhale sharply as the first wave of sailors shouts for boarding. Horses whinny, panicked by the rocking floors beneath them. Soldiers jostle forward, clutching muskets and bedrolls, trying not to look at the churning nightmare below. You join a group trudging toward the waterline, the taste of sea salt stinging your lips as the wind whips your coat. Officers bark orders over the roar, but most of the words dissolve into the gale. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some French officers brought little paper packets of perfume to counter seasickness, believing strong scents could ward off nausea. You picture a lieutenant holding lavender to his nose while the barge beneath him bucks like a caffeine-addicted donkey. The loading is chaos, disguised as procedure. Horses are lashed into tight rows, their eyes rolling white with fear. Cannon wheels creak as crews wrestle them into position. The smell of wet wood, tar, sweat, and nervous hope fills the air. You notice a sailor hammering a loose plank with all the enthusiasm of someone trying not to think about drowning. Another mutters, "May the saints be carpenters today," before crossing himself quickly. Out past the foam, Villeneuve's battered but victorious fleet spreads into a protective screen. Warships form a defensive arc, their sails taut, their masts swaying slightly as they hold position against the wind. They're bruised, spars cracked, rigging torn, hulls scarred, but they're enough. They're the shield Napoleon always needed but never had. You watch the first wave of barges shove off, each one lurching violently as soon as it loses the comfort of the shoreline. Soldiers grip the rails, some already turning green. The waves slap the hulls in punishing rhythms. A sergeant next to you jokes that if seasickness were a weapon, Britain would already be conquered. You can't tell if he's trying to reassure his men or himself. As more barges push out, you see the truth of what's happening. This isn't a graceful invasion. It's a desperate scramble through a natural meat grinder. The storm hasn't peaked, but the waves are big enough to swallow smaller craft. One barge dips so low its bow disappears beneath a crest before popping up again like a drenched cork. Another takes a slap of water so hard that half the men aboard instinctively duck. Yet amid the chaos, something remarkable unfolds. Villeneuve's ships maneuver tightly, shielding the vulnerable craft from the worst of the British harassment. A British sloop appears on the horizon, hoping to pick off stragglers, but a Spanish 74 gunship turns, firing warning shots that force it to flee. The Allies have teeth today, and the British no longer feel invincible. You find yourself staggering toward the next group of departing barges, boots slipping on the rain-slick planks. Soldiers shuffle beside you, their expressions a mix of determination, dread, and the hollow sort of humor people use when their fate depends on weather patterns. One mutters, "If I die, tell my wife I was brave. Actually, tell her I fell heroically, rescuing a barrel of wine." Napoleon himself stands on a raised platform overlooking the water, cloak snapping in the wind. His face is unreadable, focused, cold, calculating. He watches each barge bob forward into the teeth of the storm, as if willing the sea to yield. If he's afraid, he doesn't show it. If he's uncertain, he buries it beneath a gaze sharp enough to cut canvas. Hours blur together in a rhythm of shouting, splashing, and frantic motion. The tide surges higher. Rain needles your face. The channel becomes a heaving, living thing, trying to hurl back every vessel that dares challenge it. Some barges are lost. You hear one crack in half with a sound like a snapped bone. But most survive. Most keep pushing northward under the protective shell of the Franco-Spanish fleet. By mid-afternoon, you glimpse the faint outline of England through the mist. Kent's cliffs rise like ghostly fangs above the turbulent surf. Soldiers gasp when they see them, not because the sight is beautiful, but because it's real. Britain has never looked so close, so reachable, so human. You feel the shift in the world again. The moment when impossible things suddenly look achievable. The rain lightens. The wind eases for a heartbeat. And you think, they're going to make it. They're actually going to land. In the last seconds before your barge hits the surf, a wave slams the hull so hard you lose your footing. The deck tilts violently. Men scream. A horse rears. But the beach is right there, close enough to taste in the salty air. Napoleon's invasion of Britain is no longer a plan or a threat. It's happening. Your barge hits the English surf with a bone-rattling jolt that sends half the men sprawling, and the other half grabbing whatever they can reach. For a moment, you think the entire vessel might roll sideways, but a second wave shoves you forward, scraping the hull along the seabed until the barge jerks to a halt. The ramp drops with a clatter that barely rises above the roar of wind and surf, and suddenly, you're staring at the pebbled, sea-soaked edge of Kent, England, close enough for the spray to sting your eyes. You stagger down the ramp with the others, boots sinking ankle-deep into wet shingle. The beach is a chaos of men, horses, and equipment being tossed ashore by the tide. Waves crash hard enough to knock grown soldiers off balance. You hear French officers shouting over the wind, "Forward! Forward! Off the beach before it becomes your grave!" Nobody needs convincing. You rush inland, the wind slapping your soaked coat against your legs like an angry towel. The first thing you notice is how thinly defended the coast really is. A mainstream historical fact settles in your mind. Britain in 1805 had no large standing army at home. Most professionals were overseas, so the immediate defenders were mostly militia, volunteers, and hastily assembled fencibles. And here, on this Kentish shoreline, you see exactly that. A handful of redcoats in uneven formations fire sporadic volleys from the ridge, but their lines waver like candles in a storm. The militia beside them look even less confident, clutching old muskets and wearing expressions that say they'd rather be anywhere else, maybe even France. You hear a French grenadier next to you mutter, "Is this it?" with such genuine confusion, you almost laugh. A quirky tidbit floats to mind. Some British volunteer units were said to practice drill with broomsticks because muskets were in short supply early in the war. Watching a few militia fumbling to reload, you think, yeah, that checks out. Musket fire cracks from the ridge, bullets whining past your ears. Instinctively, you duck, splashing into muddy grass. French skirmishers sprint forward, taking cover behind gorse bushes before unleashing return fire. The British line shudders, but doesn't break immediately. To their credit, even untrained defenders can show flashes of grit when their homeland is being invaded. You feel a pang of sympathy, combined with a very real desire not to be shot by one of them. You push inland with the next wave of infantry, scaling the grassy rise under a hail of inaccurate British volley fire. The muskets boom, but many shots go high, slicing only air. When you reach the top, a British officer shouts something you can't quite hear, maybe "hold" or "run." But whatever it is, his men choose run. Their line buckles, bends, and dissolves into a retreat that looks more like a chaotic picnic ending early because someone saw a wasp. Historians still argue whether Britain's scattered coastal forces might have slowed a French landing long enough for reinforcements to arrive from London. Some insist local resistance would have stiffened. Others believe panic would have spread rapidly. In this dream-softened version, you watch panic win. Within minutes, the British defenders are sprinting toward a nearby village, dropping bayonets, knapsacks, and, in one case, a rather sad-looking hat. Once the ridge is taken, French dragoons pour inland, hooves churning up wet soil as they chase down British pickets. You follow in their wake, wiping rain from your eyes as you see the invasion unfolding into the countryside. The smell shifts from salt and seaweed to wet earth and crushed grass. The wind howls across rolling farmland as if trying to warn the entire island, they're here. Ahead, Kentish hamlets dot the landscape, stone cottages, thatched roofs, narrow lanes puddled with autumn rain. As French columns push through them, villagers stare from windows in terrified silence. Dogs bark, doors slam. A woman pulls a child inside by the collar so fast you barely see the movement. The French soldiers, surprisingly, keep discipline. Napoleon has been very clear: no looting, no burning, no needless cruelty. He wants the invasion to feel like inevitability, not terror. Though here and there, you hear a muttered joke about asking the locals where the nearest good bakery is, as if British flour quality is the true crime of the century. You march past a small orchard where apples lie bruised in the mud. A pair of British volunteers, boys really, stand behind a dry stone wall holding muskets far too heavy for their trembling hands. They fire one volley, miss everything within 50 yards, and immediately flee across the field. One of your comrades shouts, "Merci! Excellent warning shot!" which earns a few exhausted chuckles. By midday, French footholds stretch miles inland. Cavalry patrols report that the defenses are scattered all the way to Canterbury. Some British officers are trying to form rally points, but the suddenness of the landing and the speed of French veterans crush any attempt at organized resistance. The landscape around you is soaked in cold autumn wind. Crows circle overhead, their cries sharp as broken glass. Every step squelches in wet earth. You keep marching, driven by adrenaline, exhaustion, and the creeping realization that the impossible is happening. France has landed an army in Britain and is winning. As you crest a long ridge, you see smoke rising, not from burning homes, but from French camps already forming behind you as engineers push up temporary fortifications. Cannon crews drag their guns into position overlooking the beach, ready to defend the next waves. Supply officers begin marking routes inland. Everything is moving with machine-like precision, and yet you can't help the gentle sarcasm that slips into your thoughts. England conquered by lunchtime? That's going to be awkward for the history teachers. You pause near a small farmhouse where a British fencible, a middle-aged man with more belly than bravery, drops his musket and raises both hands. He pleads in a thick Kent dialect you can barely decipher. The French sergeant simply waves him aside, uninterested in taking prisoners this early. The man scurries into his house and shuts the door as if it might keep history out. The deeper you move, the more the countryside reveals how unprepared Britain truly is. Bridges are unguarded, roads wide open, signal towers unmanned. French officers ride ahead with stunned expressions as if expecting an ambush that never comes. By late afternoon, the rain finally eases, leaving the fields glistening under a pale sun. You stand on a hill overlooking the southeastern plains, watching the French tricolor ripple from a newly claimed church steeple. Somewhere out there, in the direction of London, alarm bells are ringing, real ones and political ones. You take a long breath, letting the cold English air settle into your lungs. The invasion has landed. Kent is cracking. Britain's defenders are folding like damp parchment. And you realize something unsettling. The road to London is open. You feel the tremor before you see the signs. The kind of tremor that doesn't shake the earth so much as it shakes the air. A subtle, collective intake of breath across a nation that suddenly realizes its island myth has cracked. As you march deeper into Kent, boots squelching through soaked pastures, the news spreads faster than cavalry. French troops have landed in force. Not a raid, not a feint, a full invasion. And with every mile you push inland, you can almost hear the panic echoing all the way to London. By midday, the roads are choked, not with British reinforcements, but with civilians fleeing in carts piled with bedding, kettles, and terrified chickens. You watch a woman dragging a stubborn goat behind her, shouting at it to cooperate because the French are coming, which feels like a sentence nobody ever rehearsed. A little boy clutches a wooden toy soldier so tightly his knuckles turn white. His father, jaw set, mutters to him, "It's fine, lad. Volunteers will stop them." But even he glances over his shoulder as if expecting your column to appear on the horizon at any second. A mainstream historical fact drifts through your mind. Britain, in 1805, had no unified home defense doctrine. Coastal defense relied on scattered militias, half-trained volunteers, and local commanders improvising under pressure. And here, in this alternate timeline, the French arrival is so swift and overwhelming that even the bravest British officers can't pretend the situation is under control. Orders conflict, units retreat, messages get lost. Panic spreads like ink through paper. Napoleon's vanguard advances in tight, disciplined formations, pushing through hedgerow-lined lanes toward Canterbury. The wind blows cold through fields of flattened barley. Dragoons ride ahead, their cloaks snapping like dark wings. You follow behind one regiment that halts briefly near a crossroads, where a stone sign points left to Dover and right to London. The officer leading the column taps the London arrow and says, "This way, mes amis. History waits for no one." His men laugh tiredly, but their eyes gleam with purpose. Villagers huddle in doorways as you pass. Some stare in disbelief. Others glare with defiance. A few wave white cloth from windows because surrendering early feels like a reasonable life choice. One quirky tidbit slips to mind. Some English parish churches kept medieval armor as decorations, and in 1805, a few local leaders actually tried putting those antique pieces back on. You imagine a volunteer captain wearing a 400-year-old helmet that smells like damp stone and regret. As you march, French couriers ride up and down the lines announcing that Napoleon has established a secure beachhead. Engineers have built makeshift piers on the shoreline. Cannons are being landed. Ammunition wagons rumble inland. The invasion is no longer precarious, it's expanding. You picture Napoleon standing somewhere along the coast, cloak swirling, watching the endless procession of men and supplies pouring into Britain like water through a breached dam. Historians still argue whether London would truly have panicked so quickly. Some insist British courage would have stiffened. Others point to the sheer shock of seeing French boots on English soil. But in this scenario, you feel the panic firsthand. By late afternoon, the roads toward the capital are overcrowded with wagons, riders, militia detachments running in loose, nervous packs. Church bells toll so often they sound like alarm clocks set by terrified hands. When you reach Canterbury's outskirts, British defenders make a brief stand, scattered muskets firing from behind low stone walls. Smoke curls upward in hesitant puffs. The volleys crack, but poorly aimed. French skirmishers fan out, firing deliberate shots that force the militia to fall back almost immediately. One British officer tries to rally his men with a sword raised high, only to trip on a stump and tumble into a puddle. A French corporal mutters, "Très dramatique," in a sleepy monotone, which somehow makes the moment feel even more surreal. You push through the medieval city streets, hearing the clatter of boots against cobblestones and the distant sobs of families hiding behind shuttered windows. Canterbury's defenders melt away like morning mist. The French tricolor rises over the cathedral, an image so startling, so wrong, it feels like a painting someone forged after a bad dream. Yet here it is, rippling in the wind. From the cathedral tower, you see smoke rising in the direction of Maidstone. British forces burning supplies to keep them from French hands. Columns of civilians stream along every visible road. The entire countryside is unraveling. You hear rumors whispered among the fleeing townsfolk. The king has left London. The Bank of England is evacuating gold. The cabinet is divided. Whether these are true or just fears morphing into stories, you can't tell. but they deepen the sense that Britain's heart is beating too fast to think clearly. As your regiment halts for a brief rest, you sit under a dripping oak tree, trying to steady your breathing. Rain gathers in your hair. The ground is soft with trampled grass. A horse nearby snorts and shakes water from its mane like a dog after a bath. Two French officers share a flask, joking softly that English weather is so miserable it should count as psychological warfare. The march continues before long. Fields blur into hedgerows. Hedgerows blur into villages. Villages blur into rumors. Rumors of London descending into hysteria. You hear that Parliament is in emergency session, that some ministers are arguing to abandon the city, that others shout for holding the line at the Medway, and that nobody agrees on anything except that the situation is collapsing faster than they can debate it. By evening, the wind dies down and an eerie calm settles over the countryside. Birds return to branches. Smoke from the day's skirmishes drifts lazily into the sky. You stand on another ridge, this one overlooking a long stretch of gently rolling farmland leading toward the Thames Basin. Somewhere ahead, 40, maybe 50 miles, London shivers under the weight of terror it once confidently believed it would never feel. And then, as the sun sets over the English fields, painting them with gold and bruised purple, a courier arrives with the newest update. The British cabinet is in crisis. Negotiations are being considered. The words hang in the air like a dropped curtain. London, the unconquered, the defiant, the mythical, is cracking. You take a slow breath, tasting rain and mud and the faint metallic tang of destiny. Britain is running out of time. You wake the next morning to a different kind of silence, an uneasy, stretched thin quiet that doesn't belong to battlefields or bivouacs. It's the sound of a country holding its breath. As you rise from damp earth and brush dew from your uniform, you sense something has shifted overnight, something bigger than the French columns surrounding you. The panic that swept through Kent like a storm has now rippled outward, slamming straight into the halls of British power. And for the first time in living memory, the island empire is wobbling. You march toward Maidstone under low, heavy clouds, the wind carrying faint church bells from distant villages. Along the road, abandoned carts lie overturned in the mud, half-eaten loaves, scattered clothing, a baby's wooden rattle left behind in the rush. You step around them carefully, feeling the weight of that silence pressing harder with every mile. A mainstream historical fact slips into your mind. Britain's continental strategy during the Napoleonic Wars relied almost entirely on financing coalition after coalition. Austria, Russia, Prussia, sometimes Sweden, pouring millions of pounds into keeping Europe hostile to France. The British army was small, but British money was enormous. That gold was the skeleton key that unlocked every anti-French alliance. But now, with Napoleon's soldiers walking across Kentish fields and the Royal Navy licking its wounds after Villeneuve's victory, that entire financial engine is sputtering. No subsidies, no coalitions. No coalitions, no rescue. As your regiment approaches Maidstone, you pass a group of British dragoons riding hard toward London, their uniforms muddied and their eyes wild. One shouts something, maybe a warning, maybe a prayer. Behind them, French scouts emerge from the tree line, watching their retreat with a mixture of pity and professional satisfaction. Historians still argue whether Austria or Russia could have reconstituted armies in 1806 without British financial support. Some claim they'd have fought out of pride. Others insist the math makes it impossible. Here, in this drifting, whispered timeline, you watch that debate collapse under the sheer blunt force of economics. Without London's gold, Vienna and St. Petersburg are suddenly very quiet partners. You crest another ridge and see a French signal station flashing updates toward the rear lines. Horses huff clouds of steam into the cold morning air as dispatch riders wait for the next instruction. A captain reads from a slip of paper, shaking his head in disbelief before passing it on. Austria requests clarification. Is Britain suing for peace? The words ripple through the French column like warm wine. Soldiers exchange glances. One lets out a low whistle. Another grins and says, "Even God did not expect that." It's exaggerated, sure, but the feeling is real. The unthinkable is happening. In Maidstone, the streets churn with chaos. British civilians crowd the town square, trying to flee north toward London. A frantic man wearing a butcher's apron waves a cleaver and shouts, "They're coming! They're already past Canterbury!" Someone yells back, "We know!" And then two women begin arguing over the last loaf of bread in a shop window. It's all strangely human, strangely heartbreaking, and strangely inevitable. French troops move through the town in orderly silence, securing choke points, escorting families out of harm's way, and pushing toward the bridges. Your boots splash through puddles reflecting broken clouds as you follow them. You feel the cold air tighten in your lungs as the enormity of what's unfolding begins to settle. Britain's political foundation is cracking. The French know it. The British know it. Even the cows in the nearby meadows probably know it. From a rooftop overlooking the town square, you hear a French officer explaining to his aide, "Without British money, Austria cannot rebuild. Russia cannot campaign so far west. Prussia will not dare move alone. The war ends unless Britain stands." But Britain is not standing. Britain is kneeling. You push deeper into the town, where fresh dispatches circulate among officers. Bank of England relocating reserves. Parliament divided on whether to evacuate the royal family. Peace terms quietly drafted. A sergeant beside you mutters, "When bankers run before generals, the battle is already over." The line is so dry, so perfectly British in tone, that for a moment you wonder if he's mocking them or admiring them. Then, as your column prepares to move out again, a French courier rides hard from the north, mud spraying from his horse's hooves. He barely slows as he shouts to the nearest officer, "Negotiations confirmed! A British delegation has been sent to discuss terms." The officer stiffens. "Already?" "London fears being encircled," the writer answers breathlessly. "They will not risk the capital. It hits you all at once. The British Empire. The empire that endured storms, rebellions, plagues, mutinies, and centuries of continental wars is collapsing, not from gunfire, but from shock." A quirky tidbit floats through your memory. During the actual 1805 crisis, some British newspapers printed satirical guides on how to behave when the French arrive. They joked about serving Napoleon tea properly and offering him polite conversation. But now, in this rewritten world, those jokes feel like prophecy, only without the laughter. Your regiment continues marching north through the rolling, rain-drenched fields of the Medway. The clouds part briefly, spilling pale sunlight across the countryside. In that moment, you see London's distant haze on the horizon. Not burning, not bombarded, but trembling. Britain is submitting. Europe is tilting. And Napoleon, still standing on Kent's cold shores, has just cut the financial sinews that held every coalition together. No British gold means no Austria, no Russia, no Prussia, no Iberian uprising, no peninsular quagmire, no Russian winter. You feel a chill that has nothing to do with the wind. History as you knew it just died softly in the countryside. The march slows as the countryside grows quieter, almost reverent, as if Britain itself senses what has happened out on the waves and across the battered fields you've left behind. You walk beneath low-hanging clouds that feel heavier than the packs on your shoulders, the wind brushing softly through hedgerows as if trying to whisper the truth into your ears before anyone else can say it aloud. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not in this world. Not in any world. And yet it has. Villeneuve won. Napoleon invaded. Britain sued for peace. But as your boots follow the muddy road toward the Thames Basin, something inside you slips sideways, because you know somehow this isn't the real timeline. The air tastes too still, the wind too knowing. You suddenly feel like you're drifting between two worlds, the one you're marching through and the one you remember from textbooks, documentaries, and half-sleep conversations whispered into the darkness. A mainstream historical fact flickers sharply into place. In reality, 1805 was no story of victory for France at sea. Trafalgar was a catastrophe for Napoleon, an irreversible shattering of his naval hopes. Nelson's death became a tragic legend wrapped inside British triumph, not French opportunity. The Channel never opened. The invasion never launched. Napoleon never set foot on English soil. Everything you've been living, this march across Kent, the broken militias, the trembling cabinet in London, belongs to a dream world woven from what if, not what was. The real timeline snaps into focus like a lantern flame flaring in the fog. You walk, but your thoughts wander across time. Historians still argue whether Napoleon ever truly believed in the Boulogne invasion plan, or whether it was a bluff, a grand staging to pressure Britain while his true ambitions pointed inland. Some say he was dead serious. Others say he kept the invasion ready only so long as it served diplomacy. Here, in this drifting, sleepy narrative, you feel the debate settle into the soft space behind your ribs. Perhaps he believed both things, depending on the weather, the moment, and the latest whisper from his instinct. But the world you remember, the world that presses gently against this alternate march, knows what came next. The real Nelson didn't falter at Trafalgar. The British didn't withdraw. The Franco-Spanish line didn't hold. And Villeneuve didn't send signals of triumph. He became a prisoner, his fleet in ruins, his hopes crushed beneath the thunder of British broadsides. Your steps soften as you recall that battle, the true one. Nelson's columns slicing through the Allied line with near-religious precision. British gunnery carving fatal arcs through French and Spanish hulls. Smoke so thick the sun vanished. The kind of chaos only one side was trained to tame. You walk now through quiet English farmland, but in your mind you see shattered masts, floating wreckage, and a horizon lit by cannon fire. In the real world, Napoleon receives the news of Trafalgar not as a moment of opportunity, but as a death sentence for his dream of conquering the seas. You can almost see him now, hunched over a desk in Paris, knuckles white, staring at the dispatch that changes his strategy forever. Villeneuve defeated, the fleet broken, the channel closed, Britain ascendant. And so the emperor pivots, not toward London, but toward Vienna. You blink, and the alternate English countryside around you seems to shimmer for a heartbeat, as if the veil between timelines thins. Your boots keep moving, but your mind shifts to December 1805, the real December 1805, when Napoleon's army crushed Austria and Russia at Austerlitz, the Battle of the Three Emperors, a masterpiece carved on frost-covered fields instead of storm-tossed waves. That victory shapes everything that follows. Jena Auerstedt in 1806, where Prussia collapses in a single day. Friedland in 1807, where Russia stumbles back into Tilsit. The beginning of Napoleon's continental dominance, not by crossing the Channel, but by chaining Europe through treaties, threats, and reorganized kingdoms. And yet, all of it built on the unspoken truth. France ruled the land only because it could not rule the sea. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Napoleon once said he'd rather fight 10 battles on land than one naval engagement he couldn't command from the saddle. You imagine him staring moodily at a map of the Channel, grumbling things about tides and sails and admirals that probably shouldn't be repeated in polite company. The world you walk through now feels like a mirage fading at the edges. French banners flutter over Kentish ridges, but in your memory, Britain remains unbeaten. shielded by the greatest navy on Earth, sending subsidies, gold, and supplies across Europe like a silent, endless tide of resistance. You feel reality reassert itself softly, not violently. It wraps around you like a blanket being tucked in. Napoleon never conquered Britain. Britain never bent the knee. The Channel remained the moat that guarded an empire. So instead of invading, Napoleon waged economic warfare, his infamous continental system. You see the consequences ripple. Smugglers sneaking British goods into French ports, Allied economies groaning under embargo, and Napoleon growing increasingly irritated that the one enemy he couldn't touch kept stinging him economically. Historians still argue whether the continental system hurt Britain more or France more. Some say British trade adapted. Others insist Britain nearly collapsed. But you know, the truth has a sleepy complexity. Embargoes rarely crush empires. They just annoy them creatively. You step off the road into a field dotted with sheep that eye you with deeply British suspicion. And as the twilight settles gently over the hills, you feel the narrative shift once more. This timeline, this glorious French march through Kent, is a lullaby made of what if. But the real story, the one you're drifting back toward, begins not with a march on London, but with the long shadow of Trafalgar. And as your steps slow, you sense the next pivot approaching. The dream fades. History returns. Russia waits. The mist thickens around you as the English fields dissolve. And when it lifts, you're no longer walking toward London. You're standing on the wide, dusty expanse outside Smolensk, the summer wind carrying the scent of pine, smoke, and distant uncertainty. It's 1812 again, but not the bleak, frostbitten version you remember from the real timeline. Here, the light is warmer, the air broader, and the sense of doom that usually clings to this campaign feels strangely muted. Something is different, something fundamental. You watch Napoleon ride ahead of his marshals, his horse kicking soft dust into the late summer air. He pauses beneath the shadow of Smolensk's ancient walls, thick, red, almost patient in their endurance. And for once, the emperor doesn't push forward impulsively. He gazes toward the east where Moscow lies like a glittering trap and decides, quietly, firmly, this far and no farther. A mainstream historical fact settles into the air around you. In reality, Napoleon chased the Russian army hundreds of miles beyond Smolensk, deeper into scorched earth, thinning supply lines until they were threads. Moscow burned, winter came early, the Grand Armée collapsed. But now, in this softened alternate timeline, you feel the consequences of a single choice reverberate like a gentle bell. Napoleon halts at Smolensk instead of devouring the miles toward disaster. Historians still argue whether he ever seriously considered holding here. Some letters imply caution, others ambition, and his marshals certainly begged him to slow down. But tonight, in your drifting, drowsy retelling, the emperor listens to reason, to the weather, to the ache in his bones, and to the faint whisper of self-preservation. You walk along the ramparts as engineers, hammering steadily, reinforce walls with timber and earthworks. Piles of grain sacks form makeshift bulwarks. Artillery crews position cannons along the perimeter. Soldiers march crates of salted meat into newly fortified depots, their boots thumping a rhythm that feels warmer, steadier than the desperate scramble of the real campaign. A quirky tidbit surfaces. A rumor that some French soldiers, bored during garrison duty, carved tiny wooden replicas of the Kremlin, joking they preferred miniature Moscow to the real one. You imagine a grenadier whittling away under the shade of a tree, unaware he's avoided a nightmare that once devoured hundreds of thousands of his comrades. You settle into the rhythm of camp life. The clink of hammers blends with the soft rustle of birch leaves. The smell of roasting meat drifts from a cook fire, meat that, in the real timeline, would have been scarce by this point. Supply wagons rumble in from the rear with surprising ease. With the French not chasing Russia deeper into its own vastness, supply lines remain blessedly short. Wagons aren't abandoned. Horses aren't dying by the thousands. Soldiers aren't eating leather straps softened in boiling water for lack of anything else. Instead, Napoleon transforms Smolensk into a fortress city, a winter nest for a Grande Armée that for once is prepared. You walk the streets as a city shifts around you. Russian architecture looms in quiet beauty. Whitewashed walls, onion domes glinting gold under the sun. French engineers overlay military geometry atop Slavic charm. Women carry water from wells, cautiously watching the occupiers, but relieved they aren't torching homes. Soldiers patch uniforms. Horses graze in the outskirts. Dragoons polish sabers that would have been rusted by December snow in the real campaign. Napoleon sits at a long table covered in maps, tracing winter supply lines, not as a gambler, but as a planner. He orders new depots west of Smolensk, reinforcements from Poland, winter quarters arranged in concentric zones. Marshals nod, astonished at his restraint, except maybe Murat, who looks mildly offended that he's not being asked to gallop flamboyantly into oblivion. As days pass, Russian pickets hover just beyond sight. Their generals, including Kutuzov, weary and sharp, exchange glances across the forests. Their scorched earth strategy, so effective when Napoleon historically chased them, fizzles uselessly now. They can't lure the French deeper. They can't starve them. They can't freeze them out. Smolensk, annoyingly, refuses to collapse. You sit on a low wall, watching autumn shift toward winter. Leaves fall in soft spirals. Frost kisses the ground in delicate lace patterns. The first snowflakes drift down, harmless, almost pretty. And unlike the real Grande Armée, the one with hollow cheeks, tattered boots, and starving horses, this army is sheltered, fed, and rested. Winter's edge becomes a lullaby rather than a death sentence. As nights grow longer, soldiers gather around fires, sharing stories. One says he once tried Russian vodka and forgot the entire next day. Another claims he saw a wolf wearing Napoleon's hat in a dream, which he insists is a sign of victory. You nod slowly, deciding not to engage with that one. Weeks pass in the gentle drift of cold mornings and smoky evenings. Snow piles lightly on the ramparts, but never in the suffocating, army-killing drifts of the real retreat. You sense the confidence of the troops growing, their strength preserved, their spirits unbroken. And when spring melts the last patches of snow, Napoleon doesn't command a desperate, battered remnant. He commands an army still massive, still disciplined, still terrifying. He marches out of Smolensk as winter releases its icy grip, not to chase the Russians into a trap, but to force a decisive engagement while fully supplied. The reimagined Battle of Borodino unfolds in your mind like a hazy vision waiting at the edge of dawn. Fields thawed, cannon wheels turning smoothly, infantry lines advancing without frostbite chewing through their boots. The French break the Russian line, not by madness, but by method. And afterwards, when the road to Moscow lies open like an alluring snare, Napoleon simply turns back to Smolensk. The Russians, shattered and unable to rebuild, have to negotiate. They cannot drag France deep into their endless land. They cannot scorch enough earth to starve this army. They cannot summon winter as a weapon. Napoleon holds Eastern Europe with an open hand rather than a clenched fist. You inhale the crisp Smolensk air again, letting it settle into your lungs, quiet and cold, but not cruel. History, for this moment, feels as though it chose mercy. The last frost melts from the fields outside Smolensk as you breathe in the crisp, new spring air. A kind of fresh beginning that feels impossible if you remember the real 1813. You stand near a thawing stream, listening to water trickle over stones, and feel the ground soften under your boots. Earth returning to life, horses pawing the slush with renewed strength, soldiers shedding their winter stiffness like old skins. The Grande Armée is not a ghost of itself this time. It's rested, fed, organized, and astonishingly alive. Napoleon rides out from Smolensk at dawn, his silhouette sharp against the pale sky. No gaunt cavalry shadows him. No ragged infantry limps in his wake. Instead, columns move with practiced ease, musicians tuning their instruments, officers polishing buckles, supply wagons creaking under genuine abundance rather than desperate scraps. A mainstream historical fact rests gently in your thoughts. In the real campaign, by the time Napoleon staggered back to Smolensk in late 1812, frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion had already devoured hundreds of thousands. But now, as you walk beside them, the soldiers feel almost spring-like. Lean from winter drill, yes, but strong. Historians still argue whether Napoleon, had he preserved his army over the winter, could have broken Russia in a renewed offensive. Some say Russia would still outlast him. Others say a rested French force could have ended the war before 1813 truly ignited. Tonight, you drift through the world where the second group gets their wish. The Grande Armée is reborn, and it moves with purpose. You march through forests where last year's dry leaves crackle beneath your boots. The air tastes of pine resin and smoke from soldiers' morning fires. French engineers mark roads, cavalry scouts fan across the horizon, and the drum beats echo with confident rhythm. Somewhere ahead lies the rebuilt Russian line, dug in around a landscape you almost recognize. Borodino, but not as you knew it. And when you reach that familiar ground, it feels uncanny. The fields are not scorched, the villages not burned. The Russian army, while hardened, is nowhere near the immense force that once opposed Napoleon. Their winter of retreat and attrition was brutal. But now, without the catastrophic French advance to Moscow, they face an army that still has strength in reserve. A quirky tidbit flutters into your mind. Some Russian officers reportedly believed the ghosts of Borodino haunted the fields after the real 1812 battle. You wonder what they'd think now, seeing French soldiers strolling across the land as if inspecting a stage before the actors arrive. Napoleon positions his forces with calm deliberation, not the razor-edged impatience that once drove him toward disaster. Artillery lines are placed on high ground. Infantry regiments create broad, layered formations. Cavalry waits in quiet waves behind the hills. You feel it, a plan that breathes instead of one that races. When the battle ignites, it doesn't explode like the desperate historical slaughter. It unfolds like a slow, inevitable pressure. French cannons roar with well-rested precision, their thunder rolling across the plains. Infantry advances steadily, bayonets glinting as they push through Russian skirmishers. Cavalry surges in calculated bursts, scattering Cossack detachments. And through it all, the Russian lines bend, not instantly, not easily, but visibly. The sun climbs higher as the battlefield fills with smoke, shouts, and the crackling thrum of musket volleys. You crouch behind an overturned cart, watching a French battery adjust its fire with almost scientific detachment. Their coordination is sharp, a stark contrast to the exhaustion-ridden chaos of the real campaign. Horses prance instead of stumbling. Officers shout with clear voices instead of hoarse desperation. The French don't fight like survivors. They fight like conquerors. As hours grind forward, the pressure finally breaks the Russian center. Their line fractures. Units begin to pull back. Drummers signal retreat in frantic rhythms. You hear a Russian colonel yelling for his men to hold, his voice cracking under strain. But they can't. Not against a rested Grande Armée. Not today. By late afternoon, the battlefield belongs to Napoleon. Russian forces limp away, battered, bleeding morale, unable to mount a counteroffensive. Their army isn't annihilated, but it's cracked. Now comes the moment that defines this alternate world. The road to Moscow opens like a tempting invitation, and every marshal, every colonel, Every hot-headed cavalryman turns to Napoleon, waiting, hoping for that familiar order. On to Moscow, but he doesn't give it. Instead, he raises one gloved hand and signals the army to halt. He refuses the city, refuses the trap, refuses the glory he once chased into the jaws of winter. Instead, he turns back to Smolensk, the fortress he made his own. The French army pivots in a slow, disciplined sweep, leaving the broken Russian line behind. You watch the soldiers' disbelief melt into relief. They know what Moscow means. They know what winter can do. And now, miraculously, they are spared. Back in Smolensk, weeks later, Russian delegates arrive. Exhausted, grim-faced, their coats patched at the elbows, their pride bleeding through every quiet step. They come not as conquerors, but as negotiators. They cannot keep fighting. Their supply lines are stretched. Their morale is thinning. Their population is weary of endless retreat. They need time, stability, anything but another year of grinding war. The Treaty of Smolensk is signed in a half-lit chamber where candle flames wobble in the draft. You watch quills scratch across parchment, sealing a future where Russia withdraws from the coalition, promises neutrality or submission depending on the interpreter, and opens its eastern hand instead of clenching it. Europe trembles. Without Russia, Austria hesitates. Prussia hesitates. The entire balance of the continent shifts. You step outside as the treaty ink dries. Snowmelt drips from the eaves of Smolensk homes. Smoke curls from chimneys. Soldiers laugh around cookfires. For a moment, you just breathe. The air is cold, but kind. History didn't break this army. Napoleon didn't break himself. Russia didn't break France. No one is starving in the snow. The world is quieter, simpler, and heavier with possibility. The world seems to shift again, softly, like a page turning itself. And when the haze clears, you're no longer in Smolensk's thawed streets. Instead, you stand in a candlelit war room somewhere in Central Europe. Maps sprawl across the table, inked with borders that tremble between possibility and collapse. Napoleon leans over them, fingers steepled, eyes thoughtful. But this version of him feels different from the one who once chased winter ghosts to Moscow. Here, he's quieter, more deliberate, as if the survival of the Grande Armée in Russia has taught him something precious. That power isn't only taken, it can be kept by choosing when not to take more. You shift your weight, boots creaking on the wooden floor, as Napoleon begins his new work. Not with cannons, but with promises. A mainstream historical fact hums in your thoughts. After the real, disastrous Russian campaign, Napoleon's German allies began defecting almost immediately. Bavaria, Saxony, Württemberg, states once loyal to France, felt the tremors of French weakness and scrambled to join the coalition. The Confederation of the Rhine frayed at the seams. The emperor's control over Central Europe began its slow collapse. But in this dreamlike, gentler alternate world, everything is written differently. Instead of demanding more men, more taxes, more sacrifices, Napoleon calls in his German allies and speaks in a tone they've almost forgotten he possesses: respect. You watch him place a hand on Bavaria's map, tracing its borders with care. To Bavaria, he offers Austrian Tyrol, a gesture so tempting that even a skeptical Bavarian minister raises an eyebrow in surprise. Württemberg receives promises of regional dominance. Saxony is assured protection instead of suspicion. And the smaller states, those that historically trembled in fear of his decrees, are given autonomy, merchant protections, and, most shocking of all, reduced requisitions. Historians still argue whether Napoleon could have saved the Confederation of the Rhine by offering such concessions. Some say his pride would never allow it. Others claim he could have rewritten the map of Europe if he had learned to treat allies as partners, not pawns. Tonight, You drift through the yes side of that debate. The air feels warmer for it. You travel with French envoys through fields dotted with spring flowers, watching them deliver new treaties. German princes, long overshadowed by Napoleon's towering presence, now see the shape of a partnership rather than domination. Some nod cautiously. Others openly embrace the change, delighted that the emperor's new diplomatic approach means fewer men drafted, fewer coffers emptied, fewer resentments stoked. Even Saxony, the perpetual double-edger, leans closer to France instead of edging toward betrayal. As you ride through Bavaria, a quirky tidbit surfaces. Bavarian officers famously loved flamboyant uniforms. Some of them, you notice, seem more excited about new territorial promises than about avoiding battle, as if imagining themselves posing on Tyrolean hillsides in freshly tailored jackets. Word travels quickly. Napoleon is building not just an empire this time, but a coalition of loyalty. A Europe where French authority feels less like a clenched fist and more like a steady hand. And then comes the test. Leipzig. In the real timeline, the Battle of Nations was a vast, crushing disaster. Hundreds of thousands of troops clashing across the marshy plains around the city, where Napoleon's weakening alliances finally shattered. Bavaria switched sides mid-battle. Saxony wavered. Württemberg buckled. Napoleon, cornered by four empires, watched his coalition crumble beneath him like wet paper. But not here. You stand on a rise overlooking the outskirts of Leipzig as Allied German troops march in step with the French. Their flags flutter beside the tricolor instead of against it. Lines are crisp. Morale is high. The soldiers trade jokes in German and French, their camaraderie surprising in a world used to fractures. Napoleon surveys the Allied coalition facing him. Austria under Schwarzenberg, Prussian Corps under Blücher, Russian formations stretched thin from the Smolensk Treaty fallout, and Sweden under Bernadotte, who seems perpetually unsure whether he wants to help defeat Napoleon or borrow his fashion sense. The coalition still outnumbers the French, but not overwhelmingly, certainly not decisively. And with the Confederation of the Rhine standing firm, Napoleon's flanks are no longer the cracked mirrors they once were. The battle opens with thunder. Artillery shakes the ground. Cannon smoke churns into heavy, gray clouds. Drums pound like a giant heartbeat beneath your feet. Infantry advance in broad columns, their bayonets catching slivers of sunlight. Cavalry units surge in sudden, brutal storms across the flanks. The roar becomes a constant thing, a blanket of sound that wraps around your senses until even your pulse feels like part of the battlefield. But the difference lies in the discipline. German reinforcements hold the French line where it once splintered. Bavarian brigades fill gaps that historically swallowed whole regiments. Württemberg cavalry don't flee. They charge with fierce precision, smashing through Austrian formations. Saxon artillery stays loyal, firing accurate volleys instead of switching sides mid-battle. For hours, long, grinding, exhausting hours, the battle stretches into a brutal stalemate. The coalition throws numbers, but not cohesion. France throws strategy, but not desperation. Soldiers fall, cannons shatter, and flags tremble, but no side yields. And then Napoleon sees the moment. He calls the Imperial Guard. You hear their footsteps before you see them, a distant thunder, slow and heavy, like mountains learning to walk. They appear cresting a low ridge, ranks immaculate, faces like carved stone beneath bearskin hats. Their advance is a silent promise. This ends now. They slam into the weakened coalition center with unstoppable momentum. Prussian lines fold. Austrian regiments reel. Russian brigades stagger backward under the pressure. The guard moves like a blade through cloth, clean, decisive, lethal in its precision. By dusk, the Allied line collapses. Leipzig trembles under the weight of French victory instead of French defeat. The field is Napoleon's greatest triumph rather than his fatal wound. You stand amid the drifting smoke. listening to the exhausted cheers of men who believed they'd never see another sunrise. Officers clasp hands. Soldiers slump to their knees in relief. Some laugh. Some weep. Some simply stare at the sky, stunned that fate has chosen a different road. Napoleon surveys the field from his horse, eyes bright with something that's not arrogance, not fury, something calmer, quieter, maybe contentment, maybe even foresight. Austria seeks peace. Prussia withdraws, exhausted. Russia staggers from its losses. Britain stands alone across the water. The Confederation of the Rhine is stronger than ever, not as subjects, but as allies. And as you watch French banners ripple above the field, you feel Europe tilt once more toward French stability, not French collapse. The smoke of Leipzig still hangs in the back of your mind, thick, gray, swirling like the last exhale of a dying storm. As the world tilts again, gently, like it's tucking itself into a new shape. When the haze lifts, you're standing on the same battlefield, but now it's quiet, eerily, impossibly quiet. The cannons are silent, the cries have faded. Only the wind moves, brushing through crushed grass and abandoned cartridge boxes with a soft, soothing rasp. You breathe in the scent of gunpowder, trampled soil, and dew settling into ground that only hours ago trembled beneath tens of thousands of marching boots. Napoleon's victory at Leipzig, impossible in the real timeline, astonishing even in imagination, has turned the heart of Europe inside out. You stand beside a shallow ridge as the sun rises through torn clouds, casting long, gold beams across the fallen standards and blood-dampened fields. But instead of mourning or retreat, the French army moves with quiet purpose. Engineers rebuild bridges. Dragoons patrol the outskirts. The Confederation of the Rhine holds firm, not in fear, but in confidence. A mainstream historical fact anchors you. In the real world, Leipzig in 1813 was the largest and most devastating defeat of Napoleon's career, the Battle of Nations. Over 600,000 soldiers fought, and the French army shattered under the weight of betrayal, overwhelming numbers, and collapsing morale. But here you drift in a world where his alliances didn't crumble, but fused together. Bavaria didn't betray him. Saxony didn't switch sides on the field. Württemberg didn't flee. Instead, they stood their ground like stone, brothers in arms rather than reluctant subjects. You walk toward the French command post, set up near a battered orchard, where the emperor stands surrounded by maps, messengers, and exhausted but smiling marshals. Napoleon's posture is different, still sharp, still electric, but steadier. He doesn't pace, he doesn't snap. He simply studies the horizon as if memorizing the shape of his own second chance. Historians still argue whether even a victory at Leipzig could have saved Napoleon's empire in the long term. Some insist France's financial system was already cracking. Others claim Europe would always unite against him eventually. But in this alternate universe, with Russia neutralized after the Treaty of Smolensk, Austria humbled, and Prussia drained, the strategic landscape has changed beyond recognition. Britain stands alone, isolated behind the Channel, as the Continental Coalition dissolves like sugar in hot water. You step under a willow tree beside the command post, listening to murmured conversations. A Bavarian general remarks, "We stood together today, truly stood." A Württemberg officer laughs, saying he almost feels guilty for how much easier victory tastes than defeat. A Saxon artilleryman pats his cannon and whispers something about naming it after his mother because it saved his hide twice. The mood is warm, relieved, and impossibly human. A quirky tidbit floats to mind. Some French veterans of Leipzig historically claimed that after the real defeat, the ground shook with the weight of fleeing soldiers. Now, as you stand here in the alternate version, the ground feels still, reassuring, almost proud. Napoleon mounts his horse and surveys the field. Distant fires smoldering, smoke curling like sleepy ghosts, tattered flags fluttering faintly in the breeze. His eyes narrow, not with bitterness, but with calculation. He knows what comes next. You can feel it too. The march west begins. You join the French column as it pushes steadily toward the Rhine. The road is lined with villagers who peek from behind doorways, some trembling, others waving timidly at the soldiers who march with discipline rather than devastation. Drummers tap slow, confident rhythms. Engineers patch bridges as fast as regiments cross them. And the German allies, the very states that historically abandoned Napoleon, now walk beside the French in alliance instead of resentment. Along the way, you see Prussian envoys riding hard in the opposite direction, their horses flecked with foam. Their mission is clear: request terms, avoid further destruction, survive another year. Austria sends similar messengers. Russia remains eerily silent beyond the eastern forests, still licking wounds from its altered fate. Napoleon doesn't chase them. He doesn't demand unconditional surrender. He simply nods at peaceful overtures, as if they were always the logical outcome of a well-set board. You can almost hear him think, stability over conquest. This time, stability. By the time you reach the Rhine, the leaves are turning autumn gold again. The river glints beneath the afternoon sun as French pontooniers assemble crossings. You feel a strange peace settle in your chest, the rare kind that comes when history stops screaming and starts breathing. Napoleon pauses on a bluff overlooking the river, his cloak fluttering gently. From here, he can see half of Europe in his mind's eye, his allies, his victories, the fragile but real order he's shaping. You imagine him reflecting on what once dragged him to ruin, ambition unbound. And now, maybe, ambition paired with caution. The march turns south after crossing into France. Orders shift, supply lines thicken. The army receives new directives. Iberia must be reclaimed. Britain, wounded and isolated, still maintains armies in Portugal and Spain, remnants of the Peninsular War that, in the real timeline, bled France dry over years of attrition, guerrilla resistance, and British gold. But this time, without a British-subsidized coalition behind them, Wellington's forces stand alone. And you feel the weight of Napoleon's renewed strength as the French army re-enters the Pyrenees, not as a scattered shell of its former self, but as the largest, most cohesive force in Europe. You march with them into the foothills, smelling pine needles crushed underfoot, hearing the distant cry of eagles above rocky cliffs. The air is thinner, sharper, tinged with the sense of approaching confrontation. But not the hopeless grind of the real Peninsular campaign. This time, the French advance is overwhelming. Wellington retreats. Portugal braces. Spain trembles. The British expeditionary force crumbles without coalition support. You watch French columns sweep across familiar battlegrounds with ease. Towns that once resisted fiercely now surrender quickly, understanding the altered balance. The French take fortified positions with disciplined strategy instead of desperation. Even the guerrilla fighters, historically the greatest thorn in France's side, struggle to maintain momentum without British supplies. You hear one Spanish guerrilla leader lament, "We fight hard, but France fights with all of Europe behind it now." Napoleon doesn't linger in Iberia longer than needed. He stabilizes control, installs loyal administrators, and moves French garrisons into key strongholds. By 1815, the entire peninsula, Portugal included, rests once more beneath French influence. The shockwaves ripple outward. And Britain? Britain remains isolated behind its waves and its wounded pride. The Royal Navy still rules the seas, but the sea cannot save a continent that no longer wishes to fight. You find yourself standing on a cliff overlooking the Bay of Biscay, watching French ships sail lazily beneath a calm evening sky. The wind carries the scent of salt and victory, quiet, heavy, certain. Europe, from Madrid to Warsaw, lies under a stable French-led system for the first time in 15 years. And as the sun dips below the horizon, painting the waters gold, you feel the immensity of what this alternate world has become. A Europe not of endless war, but of cautious unity. A France not collapsing, but consolidating. A Napoleon who finally learned to win by stopping. You exhale slowly, letting the soft wind unravel the last threads of tension from your thoughts. For the first time in this long drifting journey, the empire feels secure. You stand once more on a high ridge, overlooking a Europe that feels strangely peaceful. The sun casting soft gold across fields that have known too many armies, too many flags, too many ambitions. The wind is gentle tonight, almost tender, moving through your hair like a quiet reminder that even empires need to rest eventually. The French banners you followed, from Boulogne to Kent, from Smolensk to Leipzig, from the Pyrenees to the Atlantic, flutter calmly, as if the cloth itself is exhaling after years of tension. Down the slope, French soldiers relax beside cook fires, their laughter drifting upward in warm embers of sound. Some mend boots, some clean muskets out of habit rather than necessity. Others talk quietly about futures that, for the first time, feel predictable. Futures without the constant thunder of marching orders or the anxiety of tomorrow's campaign. And you, watching from above, begin to feel the weight of the truth you've been drifting toward all along. Even this, the impossible trifecta of victories at sea, in Russia, and in Germany, may not be enough to save Napoleon's empire forever. A mainstream historical fact threads through your thoughts. Napoleon's power depended not only on battlefield triumphs, but on a political and financial machine fueled by conquest itself. His empire thrived on momentum, territory feeding treasury, treasury feeding armies, armies feeding legitimacy. But momentum is a fragile currency, and even in this world where the tides of history have bent in his favor, you sense the edges beginning to fray. Historians still argue whether any version of Napoleon, restrained, wiser, more diplomatic, could have built a long-lasting empire in a Europe already awakening to nationalism, fiscal upheaval, and industrial change. Some insist a gentler Napoleon might have reshaped the century. Others say no amount of victory could protect an autocratic system built on perpetual war. Tonight, drifting in this alternate world, you feel the debate settling in your chest with sleepy softness. Both may be true, depending on where you listen. You walk down the ridge, boots brushing through tall grass silvered by moonlight. The soft hum of evening insects fills the air. A French grenadier nods to you as you pass, resting his back against a tree, humming some half-forgotten tune about Parisian wine and lost love. A cavalryman leans over a map, tracing roads that lead to nowhere urgent. Two German allies, Bavarian and Saxon, sit together, sharing bread and trading jokes about whose dialect is more incomprehensible. The empire feels calm, stable, balanced in a way history rarely allows. But the calm is also fragile. You sit beside a small fire, warming your hands as you watch tiny sparks drift upward. And your thoughts drift too, to the things even Napoleon can't conquer. Economics, famine, succession, national identity. The slow, grinding truth that Europe's many cultures won't remain comfortably under French guidance forever. Not without effort, not without compromise, not without tension. A quirky tidbit slips into your mind. In the real timeline, Napoleon once tried designing a single, standardized European calendar and measuring system. Pure efficiency, pure control. It failed, of course. People cling to the rhythms that make them feel human. You realize then that even in this alternate world, he'd still face the same quiet rebellions of culture and memory. The fire crackles. The night grows deeper. You picture Napoleon in his tent, studying maps under lamplight. Perhaps his face is softer now, his eyes less hungry. Maybe he finally understands the cost of endless victories. Maybe he sees that an empire is not saved by expansion, but by learning to stop before the world demands you fall. Or maybe not. Maybe the old instincts still whisper to him. The lure of Egypt, of India, of crushing the last holdout in Portugal, or sealing Paris behind continental tribute. Maybe ambition is stitched into his bones too tightly to let go. That's the quiet truth hovering in the air around you. Even with reverse Trafalgar, a winter held at Smolensk, and a triumph at Leipzig, Napoleon's future remains as uncertain as the flicker of the flames in front of you. Because empires don't collapse only from defeat. Sometimes they collapse from success that grows too fast to support itself. You lean back in the grass, staring up at the wide sky. Stars shimmer faintly behind drifting clouds. The air is cool, steady, comforting. Soldiers' voices fade into gentle murmurs. The world feels like it's finally exhaling, finally loosening its shoulders. Your eyes grow heavy. History, even rewritten, always aches with unresolved threads. Maybe Napoleon's empire survives decades. Maybe it dissolves quietly after his death. Maybe it fractures from within. Maybe it endures as a federation rather than an autocracy. Maybe Europe finds peace under a French-led constellation. Or maybe it eventually rebels in waves he cannot foresee. You don't need answers tonight. You only need the quiet hum of possibility. And so, as the fire crackles low and the wind whispers through the trees, you let yourself slip into the soft truth this entire journey has been guiding you toward. Victories can rewrite history, but they can't rewrite human nature. Even in the gentlest alternate universe, Napoleon's empire is a magnificent balancing act on a rope the world keeps tightening. And still, you feel grateful to have walked it. Now let's drift into sleep. You relax your shoulders, letting the night settle over you like a warm blanket. The fires across the French camp fade into soft amber glows, each one a tiny island of warmth in the cool, deepening dark. As the soldiers finish their quiet conversations and lie down beneath canvas tents, the murmurs thin into gentle sighs. The world slows, even the breeze softens, moving only enough to rustle the grass in low, soothing waves. You imagine yourself lying in that same field, the tall blades brushing lightly against your fingertips, the earth beneath you firm and reassuring. Above, the sky stretches wide and velvety, stars shimmering like distant lanterns guiding weary travelers home. The sense of the evening, damp soil, cooling embers, a hint of pine, wrap around you in a calming haze. Each breath you take grows longer, deeper, easier. Inhale, the quiet promise of safety. Exhale, the weight you've been carrying all day. Let it fall gently into the grass. Your mind loosens its grip on the long journeys, over stormy seas, frozen forests, and battlefields whose echoes are fading now into memory. All the marching, all the tension, all the careful watching. You can let it ease away. There's no urgency here, no deadlines, just stillness. The night cradles you. The soft rhythm of distant horse steps slows. Even the crackle of dying fires becomes a lullaby. Every part of the world seems to whisper, "Rest now." Let your eyelids grow heavy. Let your thoughts drift like smoke rising into the dark. You're safe. You're warm. And this moment belongs only to you. Breathe slowly. Melt into the quiet. Sleep is waiting with open hands.